I see you shiver with anticipation.
To be gay and do crime is not a statement meant to be taken literally. It's more of a declaration of freedom than a sign of criminal intent. To be gay and do crime is a release from the labels and preconceptions placed upon us. By leaning into the spectacle, by choosing to live as our authentic selves, we break free of societal's heteronormative controls. In direct contrast to this expression, we have traditionally lacked control of the apparatus, entertainment, politics, and journalism to truly tell our stories, and it's because of that we want to put our best foot forward. Makes sense, right? With limited control of representation, it seems more beneficial to focus on the more positive aspects and figures in our culture. But what I would like to argue is not only should we embrace negative depictions of queer identities in media, but that it can be beneficial to spotlight the parts of queer culture that lie in the shadows. And before we begin, special thanks to all my patrons. You should be seeing their names on the screen now. I truly, truly appreciate the support. If you want to sign up to help boost the quality of these videos, link is in the description. Now, I'll be discussing being gay as a crime through three lenses: religious, social, and transgressive as seen through the eyes of the law. In doing so, I'll be choosing three figures to help shape my idea of queerness. These three have at times been polarizing forces, and as I hope to demonstrate, sometimes it's good to be bad. And when the world sees your entire life as a crime, then fuck it. May as well have a little fun. You see, the transitive nature of gender identity and social politics change how we view sex and the roles we inhabit with every generation. And I find it bitterly ironic that those assigned male at birth are shepherded into roles that are stagnant examples of masculinity that in turn reduce our capacity for emotional growth. One of the more obvious consequences of this is a limited understanding of the variety life has in store. We are only limited by the perception of the world around us, and the queer community has been plagued with what I would just refer to as the fuckery because of this. We have been demonized in life, inane bigotry leading to real harm, and the biggest justification for this fuckery is religion. But religious texts are controlled by man, and we'll just have to get to that in a second. But our first stop on this journey of queer criminality takes us to the Bible Belt, 1932 Macon, Georgia. Now, when I was a kid, there was one pop culture phenomenon, one artist whose style and stage persona were so unlike any adult I had ever come in contact with. Wearing an outfit with more ruffles and lace than a wedding dress stood Richard Wayne Penniman, known by his stage name Little Richard. He captivated music lovers and captured the hearts of millions, and he cut his teeth in the music business while other comparable acts were still in primary school. At 20, Little Richard was already a showbiz veteran of half a decade, performing first as a Turban Mysterio and then as a drag queen named Princess Lavon in traveling shows that plied the Southern black entertainment circuit of the 1940s. Other queens and freakish men, the black speech of period named gender non-conforming males, taught Little Richard the musical, performative, and sexual ropes. Performers like Esquire, whose flamboyant persona and piano techniques inspired Little Richard. And let me tell you, I wish I could find some of that older footage before he became the Little Richard we knew. But in understanding his queerness in anthropological terms, he could be referred to as a ritual trickster. In anthropology, the trickster is a chaotic good or chaotic neutral energy that sits between worlds, part clown, part prophet. Think Loki or Anansi the spider. Tricksters cross boundaries, moral, social, and oftentimes even gender. They mock authority, they invert hierarchies, and they force the community to face its contradictions. Little Richard was that archetype in Rhinestones. He wasn't breaking the rules from outside the system. He was breaking them on stage, in the pulpit of American pop culture, and occasionally back within the pulpit of the church. You see, the trickster doesn't destroy the system. He exposes it by laughing in its face. And I do mean laughing in its face. His biggest hit is probably the gayest song in his repertoire with a few choice lyric changes to slip it past the heteros.
Richard jumped on the piano and did a wah ba ba loo ba ba la bam bam. So they heard it and said, wait a minute, what's that? It was a hook that they had never heard before. But Richard had been singing that phrase for years, you know, on the chitlin circuit.
And so I started singing. Wah ba ba loo ba ba la bam boom. If it don't fit, don't force it. You can grease it and make it easy. If you want it, you got it. Tutti frutti, good booty.
The lyrics could be interpreted as gay sex, They're not gonna play that on the radio. Tutti frutti, good booty. And everybody knew this ain't about ice cream.
If the original version of this song was released in any way during the 50s, there would have been hell and significant criminal penalties to pay. Not only was talk of sexuality limited in the 50s, talk of queer sexuality would not only end up with harsher penalties, but could even result in bodily harm of the queer acts. The FCC Fairness Doctrine was a regulatory policy that held stringent limits on what could and couldn't be said. So when Little Richard performed in makeup, when he made friends with queer performers like Esquire or Esquire Eater, he shunned the law to its face, within limits, of course. Little Richard carried himself with a kind of poise that can only come from a complete sense of self. These features are what drew me to him. A man that was not afraid to be called soft or a sissy, someone who wore makeup in vibrant colors. He was a walking contradiction, and I loved every second of it. See, he was born to a church deacon and a Baptist mother, which naturally made attending church services a regular occurrence, and that's important going forward, so just hold on to that. But try to imagine being a little queer black kid in Macon, Georgia during Jim Crow, raised not just by Christian parents, but by the righteous fury kind of Christian. And any attempt to deviate from the standards of masculinity were met with violence until Little Richard left home, somewhere around 13 or 14, depending on where you look. You see, masculinity criminalizes transgressors, and black masculinity has historically criminalized anything it considers queer or non-black. It can also restrict expression as a means of protecting our youth from actual criminalization and bigotry that we all face, even if that means punishing and stifling our true expression. Death of self by way of stoicism. To be gay and do crime means more when you're from a disenfranchised group. We break the social norms of our community as well as broader heteronormativity. And Little Richard deviated far from the standards of masculinity I was conditioned to believe in, so far from what I thought was accessible, a new world to explore. Colors, eyeliner, glitter. Then I found out what homophobia is. One day when I was about 6, I was playing dress up with my cousins. We paraded around the living room like we were in a fashion show, and our parents would play along, laughing at us wobbling around in jackets and pants so big we could use them as blankets. And it was all fun and games until I put on one of my grandmother's old pantsuits and pair of heels. All of a sudden, none of the adults were smiling. Shock turned into sour glares as I was ordered through grit teeth to put everything back. I've shared this story briefly before, but this was also one of the first times I was called the F slur. After that, I learned how to mask my emotions, how to change my word choices, how to shift my mannerisms, how to be a real boy. But Pinocchio still smiled a little wider than everyone else whenever Little Richard did a TV cameo. And I tapped my feet whenever Little Richard music was sampled during a music montage. I just never really felt safe expressing myself in any way that can be confused with feminine or soft. The big excuse, as always, is that homosexuality is a sin in the eyes of God. So they weren't giving me trauma. No, they were saving my soul. And it can be hard for some black folks to detach from their old ways in the church because the black church has always been there. The black church is defined by the primary religious institution that historically has been a source of hope and strength for many black Americans. The church has also played a pivotal role in the social action during the civil rights struggles. However, this liberation ideology that was used by black churches to fight against slavery and segregation was not applied to homosexuality. For those born in the same era, let's say in between 1920 and 1960, especially those within the black community, the line between the secular and the profane was one that was not meant to be crossed. But that's the pain and beauty of Little Richard. To him, his music was sacred. I was playing in a church. My grandfather was a preacher, Reverend Penniman, Little Richard told a BBC interviewer in 1972 before his performance at London's Wembley Stadium. I used to play for him every Sunday because he was taking up collections about 7 times. Just one more penny, just one more quarter. So I used to play Tutti Frutti and Long Tongue Sally while he preached, but he didn't know it. He added later in the interview, I consider my music sacred. I consider that Long Tongue Sally is sacred. And when asked to elaborate by the BBC interviewer, he added, I don't mean that it's a hymn like an anthem in a church, but there's nothing bad about it, said Little Richard about the song. A song of love and joy in a world of chaos and commotion and strife. We need joy. When I sing my songs, you can't sit still. Your big toes shoot up in your boot. As beautiful as that sentiment was, the reality is a little different. Because no matter what truth, performance, or demonstration of self is showcased, we can't hide the truth from ourselves. And the truth is, Little Richard felt that sting far more than he would ever let on. To be black, queer, and brought up within a church can be like holding a double-edged sword with a barbed wire handle. As much as Little Richard loved himself and his music, he could never truly escape that feeling, that knot in his stomach that reminded him of his Christian roots. Every hallelujah was haunted by repent. He was a man who could make the devil dance to gospel chords as when he subtly played renditions of Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally in church, yet he was never allowed to see his queerness as divine. An academic study done in 2003 showed that once you account for factors like religion, black communities are less receptive to homosexuality compared to white communities. But contradictorily, black communities were shown to be more supportive of gay civil rights and more resistant to gay employment discrimination. And that was in 2003. The black community is still plagued with antiquated norms regarding gender and sexuality, and it's not a matter of bigotry, or rather, solely a matter of bigotry. Regardless of how often we practice, a large subset of the African American population identifies as Christian, and that faith is a justification for exclusion. When Little Richard ruled the airwaves in the 1950s, his very existence was criminal on multiple fronts. He was black in Jim Crow America, where law made his skin a liability, and he was queer in a world that treated his queerness as a contagion. Even as he shattered barriers, performing to segregated crowds, he knew that both halves of himself, his blackness and his queerness, were being policed. And in an era where black people were barred from patronizing most establishments. Sure, you can get in the door as a black person, the back door, wearing an apron or overalls, or in Little Richard's case and that of many other black artists navigating the Jim Crow South, able to perform in segregated clubs while having to gaze down at a crowd divided by pigment. To be a non-gender conforming black man meant dealing with racism and homophobia. A lot of the latter came from within the black community. But like with many of our social issues, at its roots you'll find origins in racist thought. Black men have been tasked with wielding a rake and sifting through white preconceptions and prejudices, being careful not to damage the seedlings that have already been strangled by a system that forces conformity.
Did you get that?
The 1950s Jim Crow South was a time and place where to be a black man meant to be quiet and unobtrusive as not to make white folks uncomfortable. In response, hypermasculine behavior increased in homes. The male patriarch needed to show a brave front for his family and teach the young ones how to navigate in a world that developed its preconceptions on them and their culture before they were born. It's not possible to analyze black masculinity in America without acknowledging slavery and post-colonial violence suffered under those hands of foreign masters and those white neighbors who didn't want black folks to get uppity. To some, then and now, queerness can be attributed to whiteness, an implication that it was and is emasculating for black men to wear makeup and perform for white audiences. This is the environment Little Richard stood firm in. Even the racial homogeneity of the Chitlin circuit couldn't insulate a non-masculine black man from criticism, which, why through all of it, Little Richard maintained a majority white audience. His style didn't threaten cishet white man's position in the racial hierarchy, but it did challenge perceptions of what it meant to be a black man. You see, the remnants of slavery waft around like a putrid miasma, offending the senses and sensibilities of black folk. Spores spreading a contagion through the black community, a pathogen that foils empathy, reduces inertia, and hardens our exterior, preventing us from cracking through a husk and thus leaving our gardens barren. Richard's stage persona, the makeup, the pompadour, the shrieks, weren't just showmanship, it was survival. He leaned into excess because moderation was never an option. He turned sin into spectacle, pain into praise, but offstage the weight returned. He'd renounce his sexuality and then reclaim it, and then renounce it again. A cycle of confession and relapse that mirrored the endless tug-of-war between faith and freedom itself.
Oh no, but God gave me the victory. I'm not gay now, but I was gay all my life. I believe I was one of the first gay people to come out. But God let me know that he made Adam be with Eve, not Steve. So I gave my heart to Christ.
His story is a perfect metaphor for being gay as a crime within a black Christian experience. Not because he ever broke the law, but because loving himself was treated like one. Along with the glam came the partying, and with that, occasionally the party and play. For those not in the know, to party and to play is to engage with illicit substances while having adult time. Technically, it can be as innocuous as having a glass of wine before a little hanky-panky, but In the queer community, specifically amongst men who sleep with men, there's a lot of use of stronger party supplies. Sometimes it's a twink getting prepared with poppers. Sometimes it's Tina or her friend Molly coming over to party. And that's where things get really dangerous. And Little Richard had a habit that blew through $1,000 a night. I did the math. That's 10K in 2025 money, and he was blowing that on party supplies. But that's one of those unfortunate aspects of queer culture that we probably wouldn't want showcased. There's a problem with party and play, not to mention a lack of social precautions, but how focused can you be on being safe when you're hired in giraffe ass? And sometimes it's hard to say, hard to admit that some of the scare tactics and antiquated ideals that the right has on us have a basis in reality. It sucks, but it's real, and it's not going to change. You can't make adults not act like adults, but you can make them aware of the risks. And thanks to coked up, messy bitches like Little Richard making a public and terrifying example of the harms, some may pull back from the brink. Maybe not. The tragedy of Little Richard and so many other queer black Christians who came after him is that they were made to believe that their freedom was blasphemy, that to embrace their reflection was to defy God. But the deeper irony is that every scripture used to shame them has been misread, mistranslated, and weaponized for centuries. And I say they because, well, thanks to growing up queer and black in the church, I'm now an atheist. When you peel back the layers of translation and historical context, the Bible does not explicitly condemn homosexuality. It condemns exploitation. The term masculus in the early Latin text refers to male child, not a grown man. In Hebrew and Greek, similar pairings of ish, man, and zakar, boy, refer to age and power, not orientation. The prohibitions weren't about two consenting adults sharing love. They're about grown men preying upon boys, a reflection of patriarchal abuse and class hierarchy, not queerness. But centuries of mistranslation, some intentional, some born of ignorance, turned warnings against abuse into blatant condemnations of identity. And when those distortions crossed the Atlantic, they fused with colonial Christianity, which was imposed upon enslaved Africans of both spiritual salvation and social control. The result was a theology of suspicion, one that equated queerness with sin even though the text never did. For someone like Little Richard, the contradiction was constant. His music, full of desire, rhythm, and joy, was proof that divinity could exist in the flesh, but he lived in a world that told him otherwise. He'd run from the stage to the altar, from glitter to gospel, as though one could cleanse the other. But you can't scrub the gay away. And that's the heart of gay as a crime in a religious context. It's not about moral failing, it's about misinterpretation. A century-long confusion between harm and love, between sin and survival. The Bible doesn't condemn queerness. People do. And they do it because controlling who someone loves is often easier than confronting what love truly means. It's an easy and convenient way to other someone, to make sure that they are on the side of good. But what if you could build your brand on bad?
Dennis Rodman. Unbelievable hustle play by Rodman. He just wants it a little bit more than everybody else right now.
Breaking down the barriers of bravado in basketball came Dennis Rodman, a man with no open queer identity, but in my opinion is far less than straight. He is my second selection for gay as a crime. Every hair dye, every skirt, every wild post-game interview was just part of a tradition that anthropologists would call ritual inversion. When society's rules get flipped upside down so we can see how fragile they really are. In anthropology, ritual inversion happens when people deliberately reverse social hierarchies, gender roles, or moral codes to challenge the status quo. Shortly after MJ rejoined the team in 1995, the Bulls picked up my all-time favorite athlete. At the time, Dennis Rodman was a 4-time rebounding champ, 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, named NBA All-Star twice, and had 2 championship rings he earned as the Bad Boys that laid a whooping on MJ in the late 80s. And after an aging Pistons team was blown out of the playoffs, and after a short marriage ended up in divorce, Rodman attempted to unalive himself. Thankfully, he had an epiphany and instead decided to stop living a life that was making him miserable. So he forced a trade to the Spurs, where he debuted his now signature dyed hair look. The hair wasn't the only change. Off-court antics increased, wild parties, and even a brief dalliance with Madonna. Yes, that Madonna. His playstyle changed too. While before the defensive first forward would agitate through aggressive contact in the paint, his new style involved constant pestering, either trash-talking or tripping players or baiting others into fouling him. What didn't change was his ferocious playstyle and his unrelenting pace. Nobody was willing to put their body on the line for Rodman. Going for every rebound or loose ball, you never knew where it was going to land. Players hated going against him, and some of his teammates hated playing with him. And when we look back at some of the game footage, it's clear that some of these men he played with and against were really uncomfortable with contact with a man that they probably deemed a sissy. See, the NBA, especially in the 90s, wasn't just a sport. It was like a ritual of manhood. The court was a stage where men proved toughness, dominance, and composure. You had to fit a certain mold: serious, stoic, heterosexual, and grateful for the league for letting you exist. Then Rodman shows up in a wedding dress, or openly hangs out in queer circles, sometimes with a queer entourage. But according to Rodman, he's straight, or rather, not gay. So I'll frame him as heterosexual, but in my opinion, there's no way in hell that he's never cracked a twink or two. The problem with Rodman is his lack of an open sexuality, and again, that's his right and not really any of our business. But he does leave a lot open to speculation, denial, and the down low, and I'll be getting a bit of that deeper in the next video, so I'll be brief here. But there is a need for more masculine, openly queer men, especially in high-profile positions like sports. And it's not like I'm saying add gay men to the league, because they're already there. Rodman himself estimated that about 10 to 20% of the league are under the rainbow umbrella, and while a few players have come out of the closet towards the latter end of their careers or after retirement, there are no openly gay athletes in the league, and no one on a LeBron or Kobe level has ever come out. What they do discreetly. But the problem with discreet links are the extremes that some men are willing to go to in order to protect their secrets. This has led to a lot of, and by a lot, I mean a fucking shit ton of unsolved cases regarding violent assaults and unalives by down low men. And I'm really trying to be quick because I'm dedicating an entire video to the subject, but the law rarely acts fast enough or with enough diligence to stop those who commit harm, let alone save lives. Justin Ling in his book writes, all you have to do is pick a major North American city and start scrolling through cold cases to find faces of queer people whose killings have remained unsolved for decades. Serial killers targeting gay men were common from the 1970s through the 1990s throughout North America. Today, trans women and particularly trans women of color are disproportionately targeted. Even in our grotesquely serial killer obsessed culture, we spend painfully little time talking about this. The problem is it's near impossible to maintain a broader athletic career as an openly queer person. I mentioned before in another video that future Hall of Fame center Dwight Howard can't get back in the NBA because he's admitted to having consensual sex with other men. Here, there's a larger controversy surrounding his initial lack of a contract, but in a league where spousal abusers and sexual pests get a slap on the wrist, I find it really hard to believe that there wasn't a slot for him. Athletes have faced discrimination and harassment based on sexual orientation in many ways. Some intercollegiate athletes have effectively been forced off their team for their sexuality. And in the professional world of sports, few athletes are openly homosexual. Most remain closeted until retirement. The professional sports arena has traditionally been hostile toward LGBTQ athletes, and some players have stated that they would be uncomfortable with sharing a locker room with a gay teammate. And when it came to Dennis Rodman, he would also break the rules when it came to showcasing emotion, like when he would openly cry, or like during a game in Utah when he got ejected but refused to leave the floor, or that time he kicked the cameraman in the nuts.
Oh my goodness! Rodman just kicked it for Frankenfurter.
Did I mention how much I love Dennis Rodman? The antics themselves aren't what drew me to him. His carefree attitude and his ability to be tough while having dyed hair and painted nails proved to a little soft boy like me that I didn't have to be just one thing. And as long as I came in and did my job to the best of my ability, my work could speak for itself and I could live the life I wanted. Rodman was just Rodman, not a saint and not marketed as one, and not moving in a way that hid his bad side. He was temperamental and rebellious in a way that only 9-year-olds and sociopaths find cool. A terrible father, even by his own accounts, and a raging alcoholic. And when it comes to Dennis Rodman, everything he did and does, including meeting Kim Jong-un, feels on brand. You can't surprise me because the guy is nuts. And just because I think he's a great basketball player or an amusing character doesn't mean I like or agree with his antics. But his freedom to be gay and do crime are the core components of any adoration I have for him. Ritual inversion always comes with risk. The community laughs at you, finds you, or exiles you, but they can't stop watching. That's how you know the ritual worked. Rodman became both scapegoat and spectacle. He absorbed the mockery and turned it into energy. Like ancient tricksters, he thrived off the contradiction of both being mocked and worshipped. And that's what the bad as I want to be brand meant for me. Honesty. Showing the full truth of who a player is. He was not just Rodman number 91. He was Dennis Rodman. Flawed, flamboyant, and living life in the open. Old enough to follow the game and to understand a bit of the social politics, I noticed that even men who were really uncomfortable with Rodman's behavior and flamboyance had no choice but to acknowledge how great a player he was. It's a tricky balance, but Rodman was just one of the early players to adopt a bad boy image and successfully make it part of his marketing. He took the sacred space of masculine sports and pulled up in a feather boa, clocked in, went to work, clocked out, partied all night, and dared you to say something about it. He queered the system without naming it queer. So yeah, when I talk about Dennis Rodman, I'm not talking about basketball. I'm talking about the sacred and the curated chaos of being unapologetically yourself in a world built on control. But no other character has impacted my life harder than my final subject, fully disrupting the self-imposed limits of masculinity. Dr. Frankenfurter didn't so much as crack my egg as he made me aware of the shell. But if you guys are interested, let me know in the comments and I'll go into the story of my egg being cracked. Like my previous two examples, my first reaction to Tim Curry as Dr. Frankenfurter was, shit, you can do that? It wasn't so much the drag or the makeup. By then I knew who RuPaul was and I'd seen Tu Wong Fu half a dozen times.
Get your hand off my dick, buddy!
So a man dressed in femme clothes wasn't a shocker. The shock came from the unrepentant revelry in the performance of sex and sexuality. And this section will serve as a study into transgressive sexuality and Dr. Frankenfurter as a character. Queer theory and anthropology, when it's paying attention, recognizes performance as survival. The enduring difference is who we perform for. Is a man wearing a suit and tie truly wearing it because he enjoys it, or has he been conditioned to believe it's how we should look? Similarly, this makeup and outfit are something I'm told not to wear, but I feel very good in. Me in a suit and tie is a performance for the world. Me in this outfit is a performance from the audience of one. Just me. And it's fair to assume that that's the way it is for a lot of queer people. When your body is politicized, every gesture becomes a protest. Frankenfurter's makeup, stockings, and manic laughter aren't just camp, they're coded language. He's mocking heteronormativity by exaggerating it. The essence of camp is its love for the unnatural, of artifice and exaggeration. And camp is esoteric, something of a private code, a badge of identity even. And that's what camp, and by extension drag, does. It exposes the performance inside gender by turning the volume up to 11.
These go to 11.
For an amazing analysis on Rocky Horror and its queer impact, I'm going to direct you to a video by Shasha Not Sasha.
Rocky Horror Picture Show made me a Is that too crass?
And while you're there, watch the video on Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker. You can thank me later. Before we get into anthropology, let's talk crime. Because literally everything Frankenfurter does is illegal. He commits murder, assault, human experimentation, illegal restraint, and probably a dozen other acts that would put you under the jail in most states. On that premise alone, there's been argument over how well the production has aged, as well as discussion on tropes regarding violent queers. Rocky Horror hit the screens during a time when fears of predatory gay men were national news, along with stories of death of men presumably off by aforementioned predatory men. And what did we get?
Just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania.
And murders are scary, but a queer in pearls, a thing of nightmares. For some, the boogeyman was too real, but it begs the question, does one need to reevaluate every aspect of queerness to make sure representation is proper? Now, Frankenfurter, similar to my analysis of Little Richard, represents the idea of be gay, do crime in both a metaphorical and literal sense. In an era not far from the Hays Code, Rocky Horror Picture Show, in part due to Frankenfurter's sexuality, weaponized the spectacle. And even though the movie initially tanked, an enduring cult fascination with the film has shown that even bad taste in art that hasn't aged well can be holy ground. See for reference, literally anything that John Waters has done. But queerness, especially in the mid-20th century, was already criminalized. Being gay was doing crime. Being trans was doing crime. Cross-dressing, same-sex affection, gender nonconformity, these weren't personal choices, these were legal offenses. That's the key with Frankenfurter. He's not just doing crime, he's performing it. His crimes are eroticized, theatrical, and dripping with self-awareness. When he kills Eddie, it's not just horror, it's cabaret. A demonstration of power to remind everyone just exactly who they are fucking with. He doesn't hide the deviance, he celebrates it. And that in itself is a radical statement. The celebration, not the killing Ellie part. Though, yeah, technically that's a bit of a radical statement as well. Let's not romanticize it though. Frankenfurter isn't a saint. Most of what he does is unethical, manipulative, and violent. He treats consent like an afterthought, uses body as objects, and quite literally kills those who challenge him. In modern terms, he's problematic as hell, but that's part of the point. To hold queerness accountable and complete, both saints and sinners belong in an archive, because it's important to study the artifact, not to celebrate it, but to understand the culture that produced it. Not all transgressive portrayals liberate. Some perpetuate harm. Look at the character of Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, who I'll be referring to as he because Thomas Harris thought it would be prudent to specify that Buffalo Bill was not, quote, a true transsexual. Which I'm assuming was his attempt at avoiding more transphobic readings into a story, but if that was the case, then why write the equivalent of horny Ed Gein? Sorry, got distracted. But Buffalo Bill is everything you don't want to see in queer representation. Violent in a one-note, kind of basic sort of way, sexually deviant and manic in their expression of gender. But erasing him erases our complexity. We are not monolithic in our ideals or sanctity. There are shitty queer and trans people just like there are shitty cishet people, and while Bill is an extreme case, so are literally every other cishet killer in similar movies. Extreme cases. Because queerness has always been entangled with moral panic, the moment a queer or trans person shows agency, sexual, social, or political, the narrative shifts. We're dangerous, we're predators, we're corrupting the youth. Buffalo Bills becomes an exaggerated mirror of that fear. So when Frankenfurter turns the castle into a carnival of sexual liberation, he's not just breaking the laws, he's making visible the absurdity of those laws. He's living out the queer subtext that society tried to bury under moral panic in psychiatric textbooks. In that sense, Be Gay Do Crime is less of a rebellion and more of a reflection. Queer people didn't choose deviance. Deviance was assigned to us. But like all good anthropological tricksters, Frankenfurter takes the insult and flips it into a superpower. In Rocky Horror, one night becomes a festival of inversion. The term festival of inversion involves inversion of social norms, such as temporary role reversal between masters and slaves, clergy and commoners, or a general inversion of social hierarchies for a period of merrymaking and parody. Think Mardi Gras, Carnival, or the Folsom Street Fair. But the ritual has a cost. Like all tricksters, Frankenfurter gets punished. He's killed for his transgressions. His visibility and his queerness must be contained for the world to reset. Yet even in death, he wins because ritual inversion doesn't erase, it transforms. Every audience member who watched him die saw the performance for what it was, a challenge to the order of things. The straight-laced couple Brad and Janet enter innocent and leave altered. Their entire journey mirrors a rite of passage, and in anthropology, a rite of passage follows 3 stages: separation, liminality, and reintegration. Separation. Brad and Janet are separated from a normal world where their car breaks down. Liminality. They enter Frankenfurter's castle, a space where every rule, sexual, moral, or social, is suspended. And finally, reintegration. They emerge changed, aware of their desires, and ashamed, yet awakened. Let's head a bit deeper into queerness as a crime, because it's not just about legality, it's about morality. In this sense, crime becomes a metaphor for autonomy. Both Brad with Frankenfurter and Janet with Rocky in those moments choose to refuse the norm. Dr. Frankenfurter is the embodiment of Be Gay Do Crime, but he also embodies fears of gender and sexual deviance that has led to my community being deemed as criminals by just existing in the most banal of circumstances. We've become the other that conservative America needed to battle to protect their sanctity and their grocery bills. This in turn has led to terrorist designations, loss of healthcare, and increased violence, all for choosing to be visible. Here's the truth. Visibility in a world that criminalizes you is dangerous, but being invisible is worse. Once you're invisible, you become a caricature. You become easier to disregard. But with visibility comes views from all angles, and just like learning to love our bodies, we have to take it all in, the good and the bad. The dangerous, problematic queer figure is not a moral failure or represent true deviance, but it's a cultural mirror. But just like a funhouse, it's a distorted perception. So we have 3 icons, 3 eras, and 3 different ways of saying I refuse to fit in. Little Richard, Dennis Rodman, and Dr. Frankenfurter don't share an identity, a profession, or even a consistent morality, but they share a function. Each of them in their own messy, scandalous way serve as performers who expose what society hides. Let's start with the preacher, because before Dennis dyed his hair and before Frank strutted in his corset, Little Richard was on stage screaming holy blasphemy in eyeliner. He also renounced his homosexuality, turning his back on the queer community more times than one. In 1984, a book he wrote demeaned homosexuality as unnatural and contagious. Dennis Rodman courted controversy like it was his job, and expressed flamboyant gender defiance while being one of the most dominant forces in the profession. He's also a raging alcoholic and has more DUIs than any one person should be allowed. And while I'm sure he has his reasons for not coming out, the lack of open visibility leaves just enough wiggle room to ignore broader issues regarding representation in sports or among masculine queer men. And Frankenfurter dissolved the lines between sane and insane. He lied, killed, and fornicated and looked amazing doing it. But he also lied, killed, and fornicated with dubious consent at best. For all the harm or reductive language used in Rocky Horror, I still think Dr. Frankenfurter is a better representation of queerness than the sterilized depictions of gayness on TV. 2 decades after Will and Grace depicted the most cookie-cutter gay men they could find, we can still barely get a same-sex kiss. And if you want gender inversion or any other expression of queerness that aren't bland, then you better prepare for some trauma. There is argument, and there are studies that show a correlation between positive gay representation and more positive attitudes towards homosexuality. There was one study out of Serbia, and that's where they make homophobia and stick it in a deep freezer. But in this study, even Serbian men appeared to show less hostile attitudes toward homosexuality after watching films with gay actors, and that's kind of dope. On a macro scale, it's evidence that there is hope, that sometimes under perfect circumstances with perfect representation, those with negative attitudes can be guided towards more enlightened thinking. Positive representation teaches the world to tolerate us. Transgressive representation teaches us to know ourselves. But we could always hold out, always put our best foot forward, try to model minority our way out of the situation. But why should we have to wait? Why limit ourselves to propriety as defined by someone who doesn't care about our well-being? What I think? I think fuck that. Be gay and do crime. Be gay as a crime and look good doing it.